Wondering about a far future can be a lot of fun. You don't have to worry about any existing characters, and it opens the door to introducing brand new players into an existing story. It's a big part of why I really enjoyed Silver the Hedgehog and his far futures depicted in Archie Sonic. But what would happen when Archie Sonic tried to imagine a near future instead of a far future? Would it be any good? Well, welcome to Mobius 25 years later. Mobius 25 years later would begin with a crusty old echidna teacher explaining how Angel Island has evolved over the past 2 decades. It's no longer just a floating rock in the sky, it's grown into a bustling hub of cities, and we're immediately thrown into some world building and exposition here. For whatever reason here, the writer Ken Penders believed that it was a good idea to explain to you why Angel Island is now called the Republic of Angel Island, even though it's now a democracy. And honestly, this isn't relevant to any plot points ever, so I'm not really sure why it's there. I doubt many kids cared, and even me as an adult, I don't care at all. But this part here is where we meet Lara Sue, and she is a key player throughout this timeline. She is also Knuckles' daughter, and as his daughter, she has inherited his famous temper, as shown when she decks her classmate Rutan for making fun of her when she brings up the fact that she wants to become a guardian like her father. Now, while we wouldn't see Knuckles just yet, we would also be introduced to another familiar face, and that would be Rotor. He's now the official emissary for the King and Queen of Mobius, who are Sonic and Sally. Rotor arrives on a shuttle from Mobotropolis to arrange a meeting between Knuckles and his family. He's got something really important that he wants to share with them, but he can't even talk directly to Knuckles. Instead, we are introduced to Knuckles' assistant, and it's Espio. Espio, in my opinion, gets done so dirty in this timeline. At one point, he was a member of the Chaotix and a skilled spy. Now he's just like a personal assistant. He's got this weird scruffy little beard and a ridiculously oversized jacket. Everything about him just kind of screams midlife crisis to me. And to make things even worse for the guy, he has to write all of the notes down on the smallest sticky notes I've ever seen. The guy doesn't even have a computer to organize Knuckles' day. It's really rough being SPO. But after this, we would finally get to see Knuckles. Well, sort of. We would get to see about 50% of Knuckles, as all we would get are side profile shots of him. However, one thing that we would notice right away is that he is rocking a new outfit, and this outfit looks suspiciously like something that Bunny Rabbit had previously worn throughout the Archie comics. Now, we would also learn that he is not exactly thrilled to meet with Sonic, and there's some drama brewing between them. On top of that, we'd also learn that Sonic's son Manic has a big crush on Knuckles' daughter Lara Sue. We also get word that Espio has a daughter, and her name is Juanita. She'll be a little bit important later. Not to mention also the name Kobar, which is an echidna that Rotor is here to meet. Oh, and by the way, Knuckles straight up works in the Batcave. Like, you cannot convince me otherwise. This place was absolutely copied by the Batcave. Now, at home, we would find that the reason we only saw half Knuckles' face is because the other half has a robotic eye implanted inside of it. But we wouldn't really get much of an explanation anytime soon. Instead, we would just be introduced to his wife, Julie Sue, who, yes, is his cousin. Yes, I have mentioned it before. Yes, I'm going to continue mentioning it. Julie Sue would inform Knuckles that their daughter Lara Sue refuses to come out of her room, and the reason for this is that she doesn't want to go to her unveiling. What is an unveiling, you might be wondering? Well, it's basically the echidna version of a quinceañera. This ends up leading to some father-daughter conflict. Lara Sue basically wants to be a guardian just like Knuckles, but ultimately Knuckles won't let her. When she keeps pressing the issue, Knuckles actually threatens to spank her, but eventually he settles down and he explains that he simply thinks that Angel Island doesn't need a guardian anymore. He thinks that in this new future, his role as guardian has become redundant, and it's going to be something that's going to end with him. Somehow, this conversation about guardians and the unveiling ends up convincing Lara Sue to come out of her room and head on out. Oh, and one more thing that I feel like I should note, Knuckles' formerly evil cousin, whose name I'm going to continue getting wrong likely, Linda, and his genocidal maniac uncle Dimitri now live peacefully as redeemed citizens. Linda even has a son, and that's Rutan, that kid that got clocked by Lara Sue earlier. Now, Lara Sue's unveiling actually goes off pretty well, at least for a little while. Knuckles even gets a chance to dance with his daughter, and it leads to a pretty sweet moment where he and his wife reminisce about their daughter's life. But while things are going pretty perfectly here, in the background, there's something brewing that isn't super great. Rotor and an ancient decrepit echidna, who we would learn is Kobar, are working to uncover a looming disaster. It turns out that the space-time continuum is on the verge of collapse. Now, back at the party, Vector would show up with his son Argyle, who, surprise, surprise, also wears headphones just like Vector. I guess it's just a genetic thing at this point. Knuckles and Vector end up encouraging Argyle to go dance with Lara Sue, and while Vector is a little bit nervous that his son might mess it up, to everyone's surprise, especially Vector's, Argyle turns out to be a pretty good dancer, leaving everyone, including his dad, completely shocked. But it's here that the good vibes would be cut short for Knuckles. During all of these festivities, he would receive a note from Rotor asking him to meet at Locke's Park. Knuckles would have to reluctantly step away from the party, and we would get to hear what this bad news is. Knuckles would head out to meet with Rotor, and let's just say he isn't in the best mood. He's pretty annoyed that Rotor, Sally, and Sonic didn't bother showing up to Lara Sue's unveiling, especially since this is such a big moment in his culture for his daughter. But Rotor isn't here to talk about party etiquette. He's got that big end of the world thing on his mind. Rotor points out a chaotic lightning storm that's been tearing across the sky throughout this night, and he informs Knuckles that the very fabric of the universe is falling apart and causing this extreme weather. Knuckles, however, is surprisingly skeptical about this whole thing, and he doesn't seem to be taking this nearly as seriously as he should. Honestly, it's pretty baffling how nonchalant he is about the whole potential end of the universe. And to make matters a little bit worse, they're having this conversation about a very serious topic out in the open where anyone could overhear it. And so, of course, someone overhears it. That someone is Rutan, who is hiding nearby in the bushes making out with Espio's daughter Juanita. I told you she'd come back. Talk about drama, though. Now we've got teenage romance and a catastrophic universe collapse all in one scene. It's basically like watching Riverdale at this point. Now, thanks to his cybernetic implant, Knuckles has night vision and he's able to spot Rutan and Juanita hiding in the bushes. But surprisingly, once they run away, he decides just to let it slide and says that's just teenagers making out in the bush. Despite everything going on, Knuckles stays remarkably chill about the situation and doesn't bother confronting them face to face at all. Meanwhile, back at the party, the festivities have wrapped up and Julie Sue refuses to let Lara Sue go out with her friends afterwards. This ends up sparking a bit of teenage rebellion between the mother-daughter combo here, and during an argument, Lara Sue would blurt out, "What about the fact that you and Dad aren't even?" before cutting herself off, and it's pretty clear that she was going to say married. Now, I don't know why it's important that Knuckles isn't married to his wife, but the comic told me, and so now I'm telling you. With Rotor's departure from Angel Island, Knuckles, despite his calm demeanor, would head to Haven 2 to consult with the Brotherhood of Guardians about what he has just learned. Once there, he would give his ailing grandfather Saber a gentle kiss on the head, and strangely enough, aside from the fact that Saber looks absolutely awful and I'm pretty sure is in a vegetative state, Knuckles' great-great-great-great-grandfather Sojourner is pretty much fine, and so is his great-great-grandfather Spectre. So although long lifespans run in the family, there seems to be something bigger going on with his grandfather. Now, at Haven 2, we would get a look at the Guardian surveillance system, which feels like something straight out of Big Brother. This place is equipped with satellite monitors capable of providing crystal clear live footage with audio of the entirety of Angel Island. Naturally, Knuckles uses this to spy on Rutan, who is currently having a conversation with his leather-clad mama, Linda. While Knuckles is busy keeping tabs on the drama, Rotor and his ancient raisin friend that is Kobar manage to hack into the surveillance system, and both of them also spy on Linda to figure out what's going to happen here. Now, at Linda's home, Rutan faces interrogation over what happened earlier. In a surprising twist, Dimitri steps in and defends him. He brushes off the fact that Rutan is lying to Linda about what he was up to tonight so that he could sneak out and make out with Juanita. And while Linda honestly has every right to be upset that her son lied to her, Dimitri dismisses her concerns, chalking it up to typical teenage boy behavior. He even goes as far as to claim that boys should be treated differently than girls in this scenario, and it's a statement that's quite frankly a major yikes. This ends up setting off an argument between the two of them, with Dimitri accusing Linda of always acting in her own self-interest after taking over as leader of the Dark Legion. While that might sound like valid criticism, it loses kind of all of its weight considering that it's coming from Dimitri of all people. Dimitri, if you didn't know, was at one point a former genocidal maniac who turned himself into an evil demigod and tried to enslave the entirety of the Echidna population because of his own self-interests. So I mean, talk about the pot calling the kettle black here. Eventually, the focus shifts back to Rutan, who cracks under his mother's questioning and admits to having seen Knuckles and Rotor earlier in the park, though he didn't catch much of what they were discussing. However, with this information, Linda decides to call her sister, and her sister, if you didn't know, is Julie Sue. And Julie Sue, for whatever reason, is wearing a vacuum-sealed apron when she gets called. For some context here, Julie Sue and Linda never really got along all that well as siblings. There was always some favor towards Julie Sue, which led to some anger on Linda's side, so her calling was kind of considered to be a big deal. Now, sometime after this call with Linda, Julie Sue would reach out to Sally, and even though there's a massive crisis going on, Julie Sue is blissfully unaware to it, and so this section of the story is mostly centered around dinner reservations. During this scene, though, we are introduced to possibly my favorite character here, which is Abby. Abby is the maid of the Knuckles household, and Abby is straight up unusual. Unlike other Mobians, who typically share a pretty similar anthropomorphic body and build, Abby is far more realistic looking like a koala. She stands out compared to everybody that she's close to. She wears these big open toed shoes, and she's the only female character who isn't drawn in an overly sexualized manner, which is kind of weird. Her presence is oddly disconnected here. It feels like somebody with a completely different art style drew her into this comic book and that she just does not belong. Now, unfortunately, Julie Sue and Sally's conversation doesn't give any kind of excitement, and a part of me thought that when Linda called, there would be something interesting and the plot would pick up from here. However, the story doesn't get any more compelling. We just get a reminder that Manic has a crush on Lara Sue, and Linda ends up invited to this dinner, but she has to back down due to prior obligations. It's pretty boring. However, at this point, I want to illustrate something I have never talked about before. I want to apply the Bechdel test to this issue. For those of you who are unfamiliar, the Bechdel test was created by author Alison Bechdel, and it only has 3 criteria it needs to pass the test. First, the comic needs to have 2 women. The second part is that they need to be talking to each other. And the third part is that the conversation has to be about something other than men. I think this issue actually only barely passes the test, and it's due to a brief moment where Julie Sue and Sally talk about the weather. However, the majority of their conversation revolves around dinner plans with their husbands and talking about what their husbands like to eat. They also spend some time talking about how their husbands have been adjusting to adulthood. So while technically it clears the bar, it's definitely not doing a great job at doing it. The next day, both families would prepare to meet, but honestly, nothing of note really happens here. I do want to highlight just something that I thought was really funny though, and it's clear that the artist here did not want to delve into the weirdness that is Mobian feet, because in a small moment here, Knuckles is shown with his feet hidden behind the bed sheets before putting on his boots. I thought it was kind of funny here, and it was just sort of worth pointing out. Now, if you've been curious about how the Bechdel test would continue to fare in this issue, I want to report that it completely fails it. Throughout this entire issue, Abby only speaks to Lara Sue once throughout the entire story, and they only ever really talk about Sonic's son Manic, so completely fails. Also, speaking of Manic, there is a clear, undeniable bias towards him in this issue. Sonic's daughter only makes one single appearance, and it's so brief I wouldn't even blame you if you missed it, because only about 45% of her body shows up on panel and she doesn't talk at all. It's kind of funny how bad it is. Now, as much as I've enjoyed talking about the Bechdel test, I'm gonna stop talking about it now. I just really wanted to illustrate how dull this story really is and how nothing ever seems to happen in any conversations. With both families gathered, they decide to play volleyball in the pool while Julie Sue and Sally have a chat on the sidelines. During this conversation, we learn that Sonic had a falling out with Tails, and Tails at some point ended up moving to Down Under. We would also learn that Tails got married to Mina Mongoose, they had kids, and when Tails moved to Down Under with his family, Sonic didn't even bother coming to say goodbye. I've got to say, in general, Sonic's writing paints him in an incredibly childish light here. It's kind of weird, and it feels really disconnected from how he's portrayed throughout Archie. There's even a point here where he dunks his son's head underwater so that he can get the volleyball because he feels like his son's been hogging all the spotlight, and it's just kind of weird. We would also find out later on that Knuckles and Sonic only barely tolerate each other due to something that happened in the past that we're going to get to pretty soon. It, in general, feels really weird though, because Sonic's whole shtick has kind of been how he makes friends with everyone, and now in the future he seems to just have 0 friends, and the guy just seems to be a massive douche. It doesn't even take long during dinner before a heated argument breaks out between the two of them, and it's really awkward for the kids who aren't watching in the distance. Eventually though, after going outside and getting some one-on-one with Sonic, Knuckles would cut to the chase and explain what he learned from Rotor. They either need to figure out a way to stop the world from ending, or they need to evacuate everyone from the planet. And it's something that they've got to do regardless if they like each other or not. However, unfortunately, just as the tension is building, we don't get much time to focus on it, as the women then head to the kitchen and the plot follows them for whatever reason. They go and prepare some snacks for the kids, and these snacks include Jelly Stars, Buttercorn, and Frutello. I don't know who came up with these names, but I don't like the names at all. We also get a glimpse of Abby from the back, and it turns out that she just wears absolutely nothing under her apron. It feels weird to me for some reason, and I just wanted to share that. The issue overall feels really lackluster. The kids are playing games, Manic really wants to play Spin the Bottle with a group that includes his sister, and he ends up bolting once his mom shows up, so at least we can rule out the idea that he has an Oedipus complex. Meanwhile, the girls end up playing a board game with Sally while Manic goes to watch his dad play pool. Later on, all of the women change into their 90s and they just talk about their dads, and I don't know, this is boring. This just feels like someone who doesn't know how to write children. During the night, Sonic heads out with a bottle of something, I'm not sure what it is, and eventually Knuckles joins him. The two end up taking a walk together as they try to come up with a plan. And in the midst of this, we learn that at some point Robotnik stole the Master Emerald, which caused Knuckles to become Green Knuckles again. This Green Knuckles actually ended up killing Robotnik, and he decided that he was going to remake Mobius in his own image, which is kind of like a drastic supervillain level move here. So I kind of have to agree with Sonic that Knuckles needed to be stopped here, and that Knuckles' actions splitting a person apart on the atomic level and wanting to rewrite the universe might have in some way contributed to this impending doomsday. Knuckles then gets upset with Sonic for seeing him as a threat during this time, and I don't think Sonic was in the wrong at all considering Knuckles' behavior here. We would learn that Sonic ended up going toe-to-toe with Knuckles, and he ended up blowing him up. It caused him to lose his eye, but it also caused him to lose all of that crazy chaos power that he was planning on using to, rewrite the world. So I've got to say, I don't honestly think what Sonic did was all that bad. Sonic and Knuckles would then go meet up with Rotor and Kobar, and during this conversation, Kobar would explain that the world-ending scenario was actually caused by Sonic. That's right, Sonic, who was zone hopping throughout the entirety of the comic run, is the reason why the world is falling apart. And I gotta say, it feels a little bit far-fetched to me. I just feel like there's so much insanity that's happened throughout Archie that something else could have also contributed to it. But there's no time to dwell on it, as Linda unexpectedly arrives, interrupting the discussion. Linda could have added some interesting tension, maybe the Dark Legion would come back, but instead, the story just skips to Knuckles groggily waking up the next day after a rough night's sleep. Knuckles and Sonic would meet with Rotor and Kobar over teleconference, and Rotor would inform that they're going to have to use Robotnik's tachyon displacement chamber to travel back in time 25 years to the moment where this chain of events began to stop it. Now, in the infinite wisdom of Ken Penders, right when the story's starting to get kind of interesting, we're going to take a slight detour from here. Knuckles would just move away from the plot again, and we would just get some flashbacks to the past. I bet you're really curious about what Knuckles' dad Locke is up to and why he hasn't shown up yet. So let's talk about that. Before the events where Knuckles ended up killing Robotnik and lost his eye, he would receive a call from his mother informing him that his father's health is declining. Once at the doctor's office, Knuckles would learn that Locke has developed pancreatic cancer. While this is like a really emotional thing and it's really, really sad, there is something about Sonic characters discussing cancer that just creates this bonkers contrast between like goofy little characters talking about something serious like cancer that makes me laugh. I'm sorry, there's something weirdly funny about this, and I don't know what that says about me. Knuckles and his mother would have to share a final farewell with Locke, and despite still harboring feelings for his ex-wife, Locke has a really good heartfelt moment with them as he apologizes for his past decisions and he expresses his love for Knuckles. It's honestly a really sweet scene, and it doesn't contribute to anything that's happening here at all though, so it kind of feels like just wasted time. Alright, now we are back in the story. Back in the present, Knuckles finally informs his daughter that she will be the next Guardian. And this decision just seems to be strictly driven by fear that he might not survive this upcoming tachyon experiment. Now, this does cause some frustration from his wife Julie Sue, but after reassuring her that he's going out there to keep Sonic safe, Knuckles, Sonic, and the group head out to the Badlands where Eggman's tech is stored. The group dons some of the most ridiculous suits I've ever seen here though. I really love how Sonic's is built to fit around his quills. It's very goofy. Once inside, Sonic insists on being the one to go back in time to fix things, despite the fact that this has never been tested and there might be a real chance that he'll never be able to return. However, Sonic is the one who caused this and he wants to be the one to fix it. Now, during all of this time, we would find out that Knuckles' daughter has stowed away on the ship, but before she can even act or do anything, she starts to vanish just like in Back to the Future. Meanwhile, back in the tachyon chamber, we would get a painful scene of what can only be described as spaghettification as Sonic is sent back in time and just gets pulled apart. It looks awful here. The story ends with a brief glimpse into the past where the group discusses the future, and that is actually the ending of the 25 years later story, and it would remain the ending until a new head writer would take over and Ian Flynn would end up resurrecting Ken Penders' story. In the new altered future of 25 years later, few remember the past, but Tails actually managed to shield himself and his family from these changes. He's now working towards restoring things to their proper state. Meanwhile, though, Knuckles has remained loyal to the new regime. He serves under the new king, and this new king is Shadow. He serves as King Shadow's head enforcer, and yes, in this timeline, Shadow now became king and he rules with an iron fist like a dictator. Rotor, however, has had the short end of the stick. This guy has been imprisoned and tortured for having memories of the old world. Once Tails shows up on Angel Island to talk with Knuckles about figuring things out, Knuckles refuses to work with him. And this sparks Tails to eventually speak with Lara Sue, who we would learn also retains memories of Sonic's children and the old past that no longer exists. Together, they manage to actually track down Sonic, who's living in dire conditions on the street. Sonic's children are gone, his past basically doesn't exist anymore, and Shadow is married to Sally. Nobody, except for a few handful of people, even remember who Sonic is in this timeline. It's really impactful for Sonic, and it's kind of cool seeing him reflect on how he took everything for granted. I really like how they wrote him in as like recognizing his past mistakes and showing some growth and realizing that he was not the best parent or person in the previous time. However, before anything big could happen, they end up getting arrested by none other than Knuckles, who ends up betraying them and takes them in under the name of King Shadow. In prison, things seem really bleak, but it turns out that Knuckles had actually orchestrated the whole thing to get everyone inside of King Shadow's palace. After releasing everyone, they form a plan. Tails will hack into the castle's systems, Lara Sue will escort Rotor to safety, and Knuckles and Sonic will confront Shadow head on. When Sonic finally faces Shadow, it's revealed that Shadow, due to his mastery over space and time, actually remembers the old world but has chosen not to intervene at all and instead just take his place as leader here. A fight ends up ensuing, but Sonic is now older and he's just no match for Shadow. Thankfully though, Lara Sue arrives just in time to help, and though Shadow commands chaos energy, Lara Sue has been training as Guardian and she makes for a formidable opponent with her own mastery over chaos. Lara Sue manages to use chaos control on Shadow, freezing him in place, and with that, the day is saved. Shadow is locked away, and we get to move into a new and brighter future. Sonic gets to be reunited with Sally, and the two, weirdly, immediately start discussing the possibility of having children, so I guess Sally wasn't having any with Shadow. So is this the end? Is this the way that 25 years later ends? I mean, kind of, sort of, because there is one finale to this timeline, and it's called Mobius 30 years later. This story, if you can imagine it, takes place 5 years after the events. And Sonic is now married to Princess Sally, and Mobius has seen 5 years of really good peace and prosperity. Sonic and Sally have their children back, and even Tails has left with his family from Down Under to attend Sonic's coronation, as they seem to have really patched things up, which is great. In this new timeline, Sonic is also reconciled with Knuckles, and Lara Sue babysits for Sonic's kids. Life seems really perfect, but things just wouldn't last all that long. Linda still exists. She remembers the old past, and for whatever reason, she still wants to be a terrible person. So she organizes an assassination attempt on Sonic during his coronation. Now, fortunately for Sonic, Lara Sue, as the new Guardian, is watching over the coronation, and she thinks that she manages to foil this, but it's only revealed that this was all just a setup, and Linda was in another location with another missile launcher ready to fire on Sonic. She would have gotten away with it, and Sonic potentially would have been killed if not for the fact that Silver got in just in the nick of time to save the day. Sadly, this would only be the beginning of things to come in a really rough chain of events. That night, an orchestrated attack would be pulled off on Sonic and his friends. Starting with Tails, he would be knocked out by an attacker, and his wife Mina would have to rush out with their two kids, Sky and Melody. Unfortunately, while going back and trying to save her husband, Mina would also be taken out. During this time, Lara Sue would leave her house to go and confront Rutan, only to find that his mother has not been home in years and she's been missing for the last 5 years. A similar attack would then take place at Sonic's home, and it would be done by their own maid of 2 years, who attacked and knocked out Silver using her own gas. She would have nothing on Sonic's extreme speed, but with all that, Sonic would have no choice but to head out and try to figure out what's going on, while Sally would take Silver and the kids to safety. Sonic would run into Lara Sue, and the two would find themselves in a sticky situation. The castle's security system would be activated, and in a twist, it would be centered on Sonic and Lara Sue. The two would have to rush out of the castle, jumping out of a window, just narrowly escaping being shot. And it's there that they would find Tails' children, Sky and Melody, who have come in search of Sonic to try and help save their parents. Together, the four would have to head out together to get this done. And meanwhile, from the shadows, Linda would manage to rescue Shadow, who has been trapped in a stasis chamber for the last 5 years. Sonic and this misfit group of children would head out to Argyle's home, and it's here that we would learn that Lara Sue and Argyle seem to have kind of become an item, which I mean, good for them. The original freedom fighters are all too far away or busy with other things to come and help, but Argyle managed to get someone else, and it's here that we would be introduced to Jacques and Belle, who are, of course, Bunny and Antoine's children. I think they have a really cool design, personally. But for whatever reason, they either got cybernetic implants later in life or they were born needing it. Either way, it doesn't really make any sense to me. So it's probably best not to think about it. But with that, Sonic would form the new generation of freedom fighters, and I've gotta say, despite everything that I've said so far, I kind of love this. Meanwhile, King Shadow would get to something diabolical. Locked deep away, there is a creature known only as Chaos. This is an amalgamation of Tikal and Chaos. Without Sonic there to help in the past, things went very differently in this timeline as Tikal ended up becoming one with Chaos and then was locked away in the basement for decades. This poor creature is hungry and she subsides on Chaos energy. Shadow would then take Linda, and in a terrifying moment, he would transform her into raw Chaos energy, which he would then use to break Chaos out. I honestly feel so bad for Tikal here. In her poor, weakened state on the ground, she just begs Shadow for energy. And knowing Tikal's past as a pacifist just makes it so sad to see that she's been clearly used as a weapon in the past. Upon learning that Sonic and his new freedom fighters have found Shadow, Shadow would overload to Chaos with Chaos energy and start to transform her into a hideous monster. On their final push, Sonic and friends would find that everything would start to break apart as water started to flood in everywhere, and it's just like the beginning of Sonic Adventure. I love it. Then she would be revealed. This is perfect to Chaos, and she's set free on the land of Mobius because Shadow wants it, even if it means he has to destroy everything to get it. So, fun fact about me, I really love Chaos, and I really enjoyed Sonic Adventure, so to Chaos is actually really, really cool. I feel like they somehow managed to improve on perfection in my eyes, and this is great character design. Together with Argyle in the computer room, real OGs know what I'm referencing here, the group breaks into action. Sonic places Lara Sue in charge because he needs to rush off to save his family, and so the new freedom fighters without Sonic are off. And I just gotta say one thing here, why is Sky flying by turning himself into a tornado? Sonic, of course, would manage to rescue his family and Silver, and then in a really fun scene, they would all end up surfing down the water as they managed to escape in a really rad over-the-top moment. I love it. During this time, Tails and Mina would also wake up and they would manage to escape as well, which is really great considering that their children would find themselves in a tight place, and thankfully they were rescued by their mom in the nick of time. I think it's really cool getting to see everybody use their own unique approaches when fighting to Chaos here. As Sonic rushes up to Chaos, ready to defeat her, he ends up actually getting blasted off by Chaos's laser eyes that she apparently has. Though, thankfully, the day ends up still being saved by his two children who rush in and lobotomize this monster. With the Chaos defeated, Lara Sue would manage to rescue Tikal and manage to finally put her to rest as she is separated from this monstrous form. With the day saved and the children starting to form attractions to each other, our story finally comes to an end, with Silver leaving for his own timeline, a new group of freedom fighters ready to protect the world. I actually really enjoyed the ending of this story, which surprised me. So, fun fact about me, I've never actually read 25 Years Later before this point. It always looked kind of boring to me, and so as a result, I never looked into it, and I never even bothered with 30 Years Later, because if I didn't like 25 Years Later, why would I like 30 Years Later? But I've got to say, it kind of turned around for me in the end. While I really didn't enjoy the beginning that was done by Ken Penders, I think Ian Flynn did a really wonderful job at turning it all around and writing some really compelling characters. However, I do have one issue that I want to talk about really briefly, and it's the fact that, like, the children are all just miniature versions of their parents. And I know that in a way we're going to always say that, oh, that's just what children are. They're just tiny versions of their parents. But it feels kind of lazy to me. Like, they couldn't even be gender swapped. Like, Manic is very clearly just Sonic, but tiny, you know? And like, Sky is just Tails, but tiny. And Melody is just Mina, but tiny. And like, that's kind of boring because, like, we've seen more interesting designs done. If we look at Lara Sue, she's not just Knuckles, but tiny. She's her own character, and I feel like we could have seen more of that with other characters, which we unfortunately didn't. However, despite all of that, I ultimately really enjoyed this, and there's a part of me that I really didn't expect to exist that wants to see more of it. Now, anyways, with that, we've reached the end of the video, and I want to thank you if you watched it this far along. If you really enjoyed the video, I would be really appreciative if you feel like it deserved a like, a subscribe, or comment, or anything else. At the end of the day, though, I can't tell you what to do. I just hope that you had a good one.